For those of you I haven't met, I'm Russ Congleton. Thank you for coming. So my pleasure today to introduce you to Ben Fraser. Ben's was an undergraduate here for 4 years in wildlife. Graduated in 2015. Took my remote sensing course and the Intro to GIS course during that time, and came and talked to me and said, "Are you interested in having me work with you as a master's student?" I said, "Yeah, I'm getting into all this UAS stuff. Are you interested?" And Ben said he was. So it's worked out great. You'll see that he's done an amazing amount of hard work. He and Heather have been total troopers, really on the bleeding edge, not even the cutting edge, but the bleeding edge of using this pretty brand new technology. And so it's been great. And so Ben's actually going to continue to work here on his PhD after he gets through this hurdle today, which will be exciting. And we've got his committee members. One of his committee members, Rebecca Rowe, is on Zoom, which is like Skype, and she's on vacation, so she was gracious enough to agree to participate today remotely. And Steve Eisenhower, who runs our Woodlands office and keeps track of all the Woodlands properties, does an amazing job for us, and we're really happy to have Steve on the committee. You'll see his contribution has been talks as well. So we'll have about 45-50 minutes of presentation from Ben, and then questions from the audience, in which case we'll dismiss the rest of the audience, and Steve and I will eat whatever food is left and ask Ben questions for 4 or 5 hours or so. Then we'll see how he does after.
Hey, we have a lunch date, so you gotta make it quick.
Oh, yeah. All right, I'm being threatened already. Good deal. So Ben, I'll turn it over to Ben. He's going to talk about unmanned aerial systems, UAS, for collecting thematic accuracy assessment reference data here in New England. So it's all yours, Ben.
Yeah, thank you, Russ. Like you said, the research project here was evaluating the use of these unmanned aerial systems for collecting thematic mapping accuracy assessment reference data in New England forest communities. I'm going to begin this presentation by going through the background, tying together some of the disciplines at play, trying to justify how and why we should be collecting this reference data, and why we should also be trying to reduce the cost of its collection on different projects. In the methods section, I'll be going over a sort of ground reference data that was collected here at UNH Properties, and then contrast it with how the images were taken from these UAS to collect their version of reference data. In the results section, I'll be talking about how we optimize the sampling of these UAS to collect the reference data from their sources, and how that exactly agreed with the sampling that was done on the ground. And then in the discussion section, I'll be going over the investigation of those results, some of the major obstacles that we had to come across while trying to deploy these systems, and how we can use the results of this study and what we've come across for the future. To begin, all of us, of course, know we're keenly aware that the state of our natural resources is quite dire in today's world. The causes of human impacts on our natural resources, the degradation of our natural environments have become so extreme that some would begin to title this the Anthropocene, or human-caused era. Functionally extinct environments and the degradation of ecosystem services which we rely on in our daily lives, such as water quality or agricultural products, were of course in a very contrasting state from which they were in the past. And the forests that we see here in the New England environment, stuff here at the local level and at the regional level, are not immune to these impacts. Remote sensing provides a very powerful tool for us to be able to monitor these impacts and create simulations and models for how we can understand what's going on. Remote sensing being the ability to learn something about an object through a sensor without coming in direct contact with it. This allows us to view things at various scales, looking at either individual features or up to a global context. It allows us to look at a range of resolutions beyond what the human eye can perceive. And it also allows us a large amount of flexibility in how we collect that data and how much data we can collect. Photo interpretation being one major aspect of remote sensing, which is particularly important during this study, is the ability to visually assess the type of content, the type of data that's coming out of these sensors, and pull valuable information from the data that's being produced. Land cover classification is a large aspect of remote sensing. It's labeling the actual features that are there and present in the landscape. For remote sensing, we call this thematic mapping. It's a classification technique that can be done through two primary approaches. The first one being a pixel-based approach, in which every pixel within the imagery is labeled based on the classification scheme. And through the evolution of the sensors, the amount of detail that we can get out of that, going finer and finer in scale, allows us to get more information from those types of products. Now, in a new age, because of how much noise we're actually getting in between canopy gaps and other features, computer vision has been able to mimic more of what we perceive through the human eye, picking up image objects now in object-based classification. These image objects can be water features, entire buildings, or even at a fine enough resolution, individual tree canopies. This gives us additional spatial and spectral information which we can use in our analysis. Deciding which one of these approaches is really based on the project that you have at hand. Either one could work depending on the type of outputs that you're desiring. A new frontier that's coming about in computer vision and digital image processing is the ability to make these orthomosaic models. Although the technique for creating them isn't quite new, people have been taking images, successive images, overlapping them and transcribing them to planimetric, planarly corrected surfaces or topographic maps to get more information out of them. However, in the digital age, we're now able to take images that are taken with additional overlap done through flight planning, connect features within those overlapping images, and create a geometrically corrected surface. To evaluate how these products are created and how true they are to reality or what we expect, an error matrix is used as a multivariate analysis technique to look at each one of the individual land covers and how they match up with the standard of reality and how accurate overall that these land covers were created. For the standard of reality that's used for that multivariate analysis technique, we have reference data. Reference data, being a form of correct information, is sometimes referred to as truth, especially when you go into the ground and getting ground truth. But that is incorrect in a couple of regards, being that there is, of course, always unavoidable error, and it is a subjective process going into complex environments and trying to label it as a distinct land cover type. This reference data can be used for two primary purposes. The first being training that classification technique, making sure that the algorithms are working properly and as expected, and second, as validating the accuracy of those products like you saw in the error matrix. There are two primary approaches, like I said, for the classification, and the reference data that is used to validate the accuracy of those should match the same type of sample unit which are created during the thematic layer. In the pixel-based classification approach, this is the individual pixel, or sometimes the pixel cluster, which you see in the upper image. And for the object-based classification approach, this should be the image object taken from a variety of samples within it. Being that ground reference data is so vital to validating the accuracy and also classifying it in the beginning stages, depending on the approach, it should definitely be collected. However, the type of collection method that is taken is very costly to the project funding. For that reason, a lot of different approaches have been taken to collect this type of reference data. In some instances, forced biometrics or forced mensuration, because it has been refined for decades. It is an efficient and effective practice for pulling out different measurements or compositional classes of the forest. It has been adopted for reference data collection. One of the methods which you see here are continuous forest inventory plots. If those are present in the landscape, they represent a systematic sampling network which can be used to pull out all types of different information for what is there in the forested landscape. Moving on now to unmanned aerial systems, probably the largest proportion of this presentation in the project. There's a lot of differences and a lot of different understandings for what unmanned aerial systems are. You can see there's a ton of different acronyms you've probably come across, probably most primarily drone up until this point. The ambiguous definition probably matches just how different the different systems are. The only real clear distinction is there's a lack of onboard operators. There's no one sitting on it. Why I'm proposing and why others have proposed that this is a system is because it's a system of components. You see here that every flight system has some sort of alteration or modification of these components, which are in constant communication with one another and making sure that the data acquisition occurs as you program it to occur. Probably a more distinct definition of unmanned aerial system is the divide between rotary wing aircraft, which you see here with the Phantom and Skyjet, or fixed wing aircraft, which more commonly mimics the traditional manned aircraft. Coming about also in today's literature is the distinction whether you're using autonomous controls or manual controls. This is the difference between pre-programming your missions completely, simply sending the mission to your drone or UAS and sending it up to acquire the data, or whether you have to have constant contact through a manual controller to justify and show where it's going to be taking the images at. Any research or any operations which occur with unmanned aerial systems, of course, have to have careful considerations of the laws, policies, and social understandings that are about in today's society. The Federal Aviation Administration is, of course, working around the clock to make sure that the operations of these are safe in the national airspace systems. They don't operate the same way that traditional manned aircraft do. They have come across a few classifications for the type of operator and the type of data that's being collected. What we have used here for research purposes is the Part 107 Remote Pilot and Command License. Being that no one really knows the true potential of unmanned aerial systems, they've been used in all types of disciplines, all types of management practices and data collection. You can see here just a few examples ranging from wildlife monitoring to full structural reconstruction and computer modeling. These all come across as SAMs because of the on-demand accessibility of the systems themselves, the high-resolution products that you get, having these sensor systems adapted to be so close to their structure, the low-cost sampling that they offer, and the difference in modifications that you can throw on any one of these systems. So being that they're low cost, they're able to collect such high-quality data, it should be asked, why then don't we use this to reduce the cost of collecting that reference data? For that purpose, the objectives of this specific research project was to see if UAS were capable of efficiently and effectively collecting reference data for assessing the accuracy of thematic maps. And more specifically, we used both the pixel-based classification approach and the object-based classification approach to see if that type of reference data could be collected. Moving on now to the method, just a quick timeline of how this actually occurred. It seems like most master's research projects occur over the span of the 2 years, possibly having a full summer the first summer and additional sampling the second summer. It was not the case here. You can see the legislation's changed probably 30 times as we went throughout it. Hardware setbacks then set us back even more. By the time we got calibrating in the spring and actually started the data collection, you'll see all the stuff, all the models and images that were collected in the methods and results were actually collected since the middle of June of this year. Wow. So looking at the study area for this research project, there are 6 UNH woodland properties located in close vicinity to where we are now, 5 of those being directly in Durham and 1 of them just north in Madbury. All of these UNH properties are managed for the research integrity and managed to represent the composition of the broader New England landscape so that we can use them as representations of what we can expect. On each of these locations, a network of the continuous forest inventory plots has been sampled in a regular interval. This systematic sampling approach uses forest biometric systems, which we use to collect all types of different measurements on a plot-based sample. Throughout the 6 locations, you can see 353 continuous forest inventory plots, which during that ground sampling recorded 31 primary forest vegetation species. So due to the complexity of that composition, we can't expect to go down to a species-based classification. Instead, for the research project, we use those continuous forest inventory plots to get a percent coniferous composition that is a 3-class scheme in which we looked at coniferous forest, primary coniferous forest, mixed forest, and deciduous forest. That is based on a basal area per unit area, so how much of each species group is located at the plot, and then used to, as a majority composition to classify the overall location of interest. The forest stands based on that ground sampling network are delineated here. You can see in total across the 6 properties there are 41 forest stands which were delineated. This is done through a combination of on-screen digitizing, so manually drawing through our map-making software, the boundaries. It's used with a combination of imagery from several sources and additional sampling taken by our graduate students. This manual digitizing was performed by an expert photo interpreter, Heather Grievous right here, in consultation with Steve Eisenhower. Moving on to the systems themselves, you see here right in front of you, first is the SenseFi EV Plus. This is a fixed-wing aircraft which can deploy 2 different sensors. The one you see on it is the SOTA sensor. It is a sensor optimized for drone applications specifically. In addition to that, we do have a Sequoia multispectral sensor that was able to see in red edge and near infrared. However, it has a slightly lower spatial resolution. This aircraft is estimated by its producers to last 59 minutes in the air in ideal conditions. We got an actual flight time of about 44 minutes, and that seemed to be pushing the batteries to what we should be putting it at. Depending on the line of sight that you have towards the aircraft from the ground control station, your computer, you can fly up to about 2 kilometers away before it starts to lose communication link. And if you do look at it and touch it, it's just a piece of styrofoam. It weighs roughly 2 pounds, just over a kilogram. Moving on to the monstrous machine that is the Skyjib. The Aeronavics Skyjib X8 was our first unmanned aerial system. It deploys the singular camera, which is designed just for its gimbal. That is a very high resolution DSLR camera, the Panasonic Lumix GH4. The flight time on it is hindered by its battery components. It has to fly with 2 of these, and actually can only be in the air for about 10 or 11 minutes because these weigh about 4 pounds apiece. This system can fly up to about 400 meters away, depending on that line of sight. And it does weigh roughly 45 pounds or 19 kilograms, so we're right up there against the limit of what we're allowed to fly. Now for the Phantom 2 Vision Plus. This is an older model of what's currently available. We actually just got this version of it, the Phantom 4 Professional Edition, in last week. This is a very nice system. It's a consumer-grade system which you can find at Best Buy or Walmart. However, the actual camera that's on it is not meant for mapping purposes in the least bit. Everything is integrated, so it's a nice scout drone, but besides that, it was not used at all for data collection. Looking at the permission to fly at these different locations, when we set up the calibration missions to first get these things in the air and then acquire data, we used our Part 107 license, which came out last August, to make sure that we had permission from the federal government to fly for research purposes. We also had to make sure that we were safe in our operations in the national airspace systems. So here you see a chart of the different parties that we contacted during every one of our applications. I'm sorry for those of you that were subjected to the constant emailing that we had to give you the day before because the weather kept changing. For the mission planning, this is the autonomous pre-programming that we did with the different aircraft. What this allowed us to do, first with the ground station software attached to the Skyjib, was send it up and send it to different waypoints, course, that system, the software package was completely obsolete even when we began using it, and I don't think I can get it running on any of my computers anymore. Because of that and several other setbacks, the SkyJib itself was actually not used in any of the data collections for the results. Now, looking at the bottom, we see eMotion 3 set up with the SenseFly EV. It's a much more user-intuitive application which allows you to set up different areas to fly based on how long you actually want to go for, how long of an area you want to, cover. Manual control scenarios are available, especially for the Phantom, which does that primarily, and for the SkyJib. Because of the setup of the EV, it is highly recommended, even from the producer, to not use manual capabilities. There is a controller due to legal obligations included with it, but that one was completely done through autonomous controls, which were pre-programmed. Looking at how we calibrated these systems and decided on the optimal efficiency for sampling and collecting the images, we see that there's a definite trade-off between flying height and the amount of detail and the amount of area that you're going to cover. Here on the left side of the screen, you see an image which is 125 meters above that forest canopy. Although it appears pretty close, it is taken by the DSLR camera that's 375 feet away from it. Now as I go through the images, you'll be able to see directly over that same central location, moving down to 100 meters above that forest canopy, 50 meters above that forest canopy, and then 25 meters above that same exact location of the forest canopy. There's a definite trade-off in the amount of detail is there, so we did have to test how the image quality came out, how safe was it to fly at those different flying heights, and what type of models do we actually produce from images of that extent. Additionally, during the calibration steps, we did take the Phantom and the SkyJib out to the Wildcat Stadium, and we went through the entire modeling process using an area of known measurements. So because we know the yard lines, we know all the distances and dimensions, we were able to go through that modeling process to make sure it actually came out looking like a football field. Once the images were collected, the spatial data had to be attached to them so that it could be modeled and corrected geometrically. The first step in that was taking the images, which you see by the red squares there, and attaching it to the flight data, which are logged on board the systems. Once that was performed, a Structure for Motion software packages were actually able to align the images in space based on their spatial location, and then look at the successive overlap in them, attach common features, and model corrected surfaces. So this is a picture of Agisoft, one of the primary Structure for Motion software packages which are out there right now. We use both Agisoft PhotoScan and Pix4D Mapper Pro to look at how they competed against each other. When asking with other operators and pilots which one they preferred, Pix4D does have a little bit of a better user interface. However, the accuracy and the comprehensive modeling of each of the software packages, there really hasn't been one that's pulled ahead quite yet. Depends entirely on the project at hand. Once those orthomosaic surfaces, the corrected surfaces, were created, pixel-based classification and object-based classification reference samples could be clipped from them. For the pixel-based classification method, these reference samples represented 90 by 90 meter clusters of pixels in which the central 30 by 30 meter area was used to interpret and then classify the land cover area. There are two sampling approaches which were used here to collect the samples from the unmanned aerial system. The first one was clipping the areas which were just centrally located in the land cover area, which you see from the different stands. And the second method was used to collect those samples directly over the continuous forest inventory plots located in the landscapes. For the object-based classification method, these reference samples had to mimic the same sample unit which were used in the classification. This is the image object level or the forest stand itself. There are two sampling protocols, sampling methods, which were used during this classification to pull the reference samples from the unmanned aerial systems. The first ones being random sampling throughout the forest stands, in which each of those subsamples was classified to confirm a majority composition of the overall forest stand. The second method of that was locating those individual subsamples directly at the locations of the CFI plots, and then once again classifying them individually to confirm a majority composition of the forest stand. Once those individual samples or subsamples could be clipped from the orthomosaics, they had to be photo-interpreted to judge their composition. Looking at how photo interpretation is done, you can see there's a high amount of detail in the products that are being created. So looking at the different species groups, you can see that deciduous species located down below are billowy, they're soft, you can see broad leaves in most instances. And then looking back at coniferous species, you see a jagged branching pattern, a really tight crown on it, and a much deeper distribution on them. During the photo interpretation portion of the analysis, it is always recommended that you have some sort of guide for how that is taking place. That's the training data, training and classification. In this instance, West Foss Farm, one of the study areas, was used to collect the training data. Because it was used in this purpose, and we do definitely confirm the classification of those samples, they were not again used during the accuracy assessment to avoid the unbiased that's there. But you do see that there are several locations here representing everything from a pure coniferous stand located in that central 30 by 30 meter section to an area that's on the edge of a mixed forest stand, and then also a deciduous forest stand located in the central section on the edge again of a mixed forest stand. For the pixel-based classification, looking at the agreement between how these orthomosaic reference samples compare to what was classified on the ground, the sample unit represents that 90 by 90 meter cluster of pixels in which the central 30 by 30 meter was interpreted. We compared what the ground sampling data classified the land cover as to what these UAS reference samples classified the land cover as. For the object-based classification approach, like I said, there were two sampling methods for this. The first two being for the random sampling within the forest stand, and the second two being for those locations that were directly at the same position of the CFI plots. During this method, both the individual subsamples which were interpreted were compared to the overall classification of the forest stands, and at the image object level, the classifications were compared between the two data sources. Once the accuracy of these samples were confirmed, it was important to also look at the efficiency of this sampling platform. We have from previous studies that there have been analysis of going to the ground and optimizing how ground sampling for reference data has been confirmed. We can see that even with a minimum number of sample units within the forest stand, you can accurately label the classification of that image object. Trying to compare our results to what is shown from this study, we looked at accuracy thresholds. We looked at accuracy thresholds of 99%, 96%, and 90% to see if, with a minimum number of samples from the unmanned aerial systems, can we still accurately label the image object classification. Moving on to now the results of the sampling optimization and the classification. First, looking at the flying height effectiveness, all the results and discussion come from sampling with the EV Plus platform. You see here that when we flew at different flying heights, anything below 100 meters above the canopy, so below 300 feet above the forest canopy, was not able to create a complete model. You see from the upper images, these are the image calibration statistics. That means the images in green, which are tied together in the diagram to its right, were actually used, and they were actually able to match features within them to the surrounding overlapping images. Those images which appear in red were not able to match even as few as 2 features within their imagery due to the automated processing of the software. They could not be used for the matching or calibration, and then did not appear in the orthomosaic. So you can see from the model that was produced, there are image artifacts within it. There's a lot of interpolation, blurry areas coming out of those types of products. The success of flying at this height, at 50 meters above the canopy, was only 62% using the images. Although the ground sampling distance or the spatial resolution of this final product is very high or very low, being at just over 2 centimeters, because there are image artifacts and a lot of extrapolation and interpolation going on there, the final product could not be used for interpolation. We also tested the flying heights of 100 meters above the canopy and 120 meters above the canopy. We went to that maximum because it's just under the maximum flying height we're allowed legally. When comparing those two, the resolution of the final product and the calibration of the images really didn't differ very much, so we decided that 120 meters, being that it had the highest calibration success, was used during the analysis. Also, in a simple test, we did apply the Sequoia sensor on the EV platform in comparison to the SOTA sensor, the one that was optimized for drone applications. And we can see, due to its lower spatial resolution and difference in camera design, it was not able to calibrate nearly as many of the images that were taken. Although this is the same area from that last diagram, the last slide, which should represent approximately 17 acres, you can see only 22% of the images actually appeared, and those that appear were taken from their original capture location, the blue, and dragged to the green, where actually the model itself says it calibrated the image to. And because of that, there are a lot of blurred quality effects, and the overall model just could not be produced. Comparing both of the Structure for Motion software packages, we looked at, of course, Agisoft PhotoScan and Pix4D Mapper Pro. Through our various calibration missions, flying at different flying heights, flying with different sensors on them, flying with different amounts of overlap between the images, we had ground sampling distance or spatial resolutions of 2 centimeters to 17 centimeters. We compared specifically Kingman Farm, West Foss Farm, and Moore Field with the same exact software processing parameters between the two to decide which one of the software packages would be better for our scenarios. Looking at that, Agisoft PhotoScan was able to use an approximate 8% higher number of images. They were able to calibrate and find matches between the images 8% more of the time. And it had a higher spatial resolution or ground sampling distance of just about 9.2%. For larger areas, it was also found much more commonly that this is a picture of Pix4D Mapper. When you plug in 20 gigabytes or 25 gigabytes of images, it takes those and calibrates them all over the place. Agisoft is not immune to this, but Pix4D did have this occur more often. Looking now at the final orthomosaics which were produced, you do see an example of one on the table there. That was not one used during the analysis. It was processed after the fact to have the entire thing as one structure. But there were 8 orthomosaics created during the imaging process and processing process. That is because Thompson Farm and College Woods, seen down below, were divided in two due to their size and distribution. These orthomosaics covered over 980 acres of land. That took place with just about 9,200 images, and by the time the models were processed, 101 gigabytes of data. These orthomosaics range from approximately 2.9 centimeters to 3.5 centimeters in spatial resolution, with an average of 3.23 centimeters across the 980 acres. Looking now at the accuracy of the UAS orthomosaics in comparison to the ground sampling CFI plot classification of those land cover areas, we see that when the pixel-based classification 90 by 90 meter clusters was sampled centrally over the land cover areas, there was an agreement of just about 69% across the samples. For the pixel-based classification samples, which are located directly at known CFI plot locations, the accuracy was then nearly 74%. For the object-based classification samples, which are sampled randomly throughout those forest stands, the individual subsamples had an accuracy of nearly 64%. And when looking at the image object level for those randomly sampled UAS orthomosaic subsamples, we see an accuracy of 71.43%. For the object-based classification method, the final method, which located those object-based subsamples directly at known CFI plot locations, we see an accuracy of 62.8%. And when looking at the image object level classification of those forest stands, we see an accuracy of 85.7%. So with those classification accuracies, we use the object-based classification approach to look at the efficiency of using the UAS platform for accurately labeling those forest stand classifications. We see an accuracy thresholds of 99%, 96%, and 90%. That the overall average of classifying those land cover areas required at least 7 or 8 samples. Some of the locations were able to accurately label the classification with as few as 3 samples, and the ones that were not available were not able to determine a minimum number of samples because it's not proper during that classification technique to use only a single sample during the reference data collection. Moving on now to investigating those results and the obstacles and errors which were incurred. To determine the optimal sampling approach, we did fly at a number of different flying heights, like we showed you in the imagery and with the modeling. We did determine that our maximum flying height at 120 meters was best suited. It is recommended, though, by the software companies, because of how dense the vegetation is and the type of modeling we're trying to create, that you should fly a minimum of a 10 centimeter per pixel ground sampling distance. That's over 3 times the ground sampling distance we did, meaning at least a 3 times higher flying height. That is not possible due to legal restrictions. We were not able to go over 400 feet, so we did fly the maximum possible. And that is because, of course, that trade-off between the detail and what the model, the computer vision, is trying to overcome, is trying to match individual features within the overlapping images, which you see there, and combine those features to create a geometrically created model. But it's not quite capable when you go at lower flying heights and higher spatial resolutions. The results of the pixel-based classification, like I said, came up with 69% for the samples which were centrally located within those land cover classes, and 73.8% for areas which are located directly at known CFI plot locations. Those aren't necessarily bad accuracy results to come across. There is no threshold for what distinctifies what an acceptable accuracy is. It's dependent on the project parameters. However, this is a very low number of samples to come across due to the location and the distribution and the orientation of those forest land cover areas. You could not fit the 90 by 90 meter clusters within more of them or have more of them distributed. Because of that, it is not quite statistically valid to look at that as an accurate representation of what the platform could achieve. It is also inherently difficult to distinguish or photo interpret some of the pure deciduous stands with sampling sizes of that nature. But we do know, although these aren't bad accuracy results to achieve for pixel-based classification, we do also recognize that with how heterogeneous the land cover areas are, or how different they are even over short distributions, that having a single reference sample located within that land cover type may not achieve its true potential. Looking at the object-based classification approaches, we saw an accuracy of 71.4% when looking at the randomly sampled locations throughout those forest stands, and an 85.7% when looking at the classification results when the samples are taken directly at known CFI plot locations. These are much higher accuracies, more representational of what you would expect in complex forest environments. Of course, there is still some difficulty in trying to interpret some of these areas. I'm not an expert photo interpreter. I don't have quite as much experience, so there could be some error there. Also, the high diversity, even over short distances, could come into play if there's some positional misregistration between where the CFI plot location says it is on the map and where it actually is located. Trying to line up the UAS orthomosaic samples might not be completely competent. looking at the efficiency analysis of that object-based classification, we did see that a higher number of samples was needed in some scenarios to judge whether you could accurately classify the forest land cover stands using the UAS orthomosaic samples. However, in many instances, you could not find the minimum number of samples needed. Using regression analysis and working down from 10 samples to 9 samples all the way down to 2 samples, it could not be determined to a 90% accuracy threshold the minimum number of samples needed. So also due to the low sampling size, only 6 of the forest stands located throughout that 980 acres were actually able to be used during this process, actually had a number of 10, at least a minimum number of 10 samples located within them. It would be suggested that a higher number of samples be used to perform this type of analysis. Some of the major limitations that came across during this project, some of the errors that were unavoidable at the time, is of course calibrating the UAS took a lot of practice. We flew a lot of training missions over different environments simply to try to get the UAS in the air without crashing, and then also make sure that it flew on its intended course and collected the images it needed to. In some of the forest stands, we did have to fly the same mission multiple times. We did also run into the case a couple of times of leaving the lens cap on the EV. But now with how great it is, there is actually a lens cap sensor on it, so we'll never do that again. It'll be incredibly fast. Processing thousands of images also took an extraordinary amount of time, even with our newest and best computer. It took multiple days for it to go through one stage of processing, and then it would just break. So because of how rapidly we collected the 9,200 images, it actually did take more time to process those 8 orthomosaics than it did to capture the images themselves. So it is, of course, it's highly relevant in all the unmanned aerial system literature that processing is in high demand when capturing such high resolution products. One of the errors that could have occurred, or one of the difficulties that was undertaken during the photo interpretation process, was interpreting the images with their summer leaf-on composition, trying to determine the difference between a deciduous species and a coniferous species. It's much more difficult when all the leaves are there versus when you look at it in the wintertime and all the deciduous species have lost their leaves. It should be realized that the classification and the labeling of land cover compositions, especially in complex environments such as this, is a subjective process to some degree. Even with a number of experts in the room, the difference in labeling could change among who's looking at it. Some future considerations, especially for the conservation sciences, taking away the results of this study, is that a high amount of high resolution and highly accurate data was collected in a very short amount of time. Using those 9,200 images, large expanses of areas in complex environments could be captured. Direct sampling of the location, so if we're able to directly sample and then take images from the UAS in the same time frame, could have possibly changed some of the results of the analysis, so that would be recommended for the future. Another product besides the orthomosaics that did come out of this project were these comprehensive models. This is a 3-dimensional point cloud of approximately 220 million points. This is the point cloud for the orthomosaic, which you see on the table. It is a 3-dimensional rendition of the College Woods natural area. Considerations for the unmanned aerial system platform and the regulations which control them at this time is, of course, all types of scenarios and modifications are used in a variety of scientific and management fields. People are using these to reduce the cost of sampling, but not necessarily replace having people on the ground and looking at those systems. It's invaluable to completely remove the people from the system that you're trying to observe. But there is a heightened involvement in the consumer market. You can see from the yearly updates that they do on complete sensor platforms that there is a consumer demand for these products. You can also see from the policy side legislations which usually take years to completely transform. In the case of this research project, the permissions and the verifications that we had to go through to fly these to collect research data have completely changed since the 2 years we've started it. Some of the conclusions that we can take away from the type of results that we have is, of course, that 980 acres were covered at a very high resolution. The average across that being 3.23 centimeters. That's a much higher resolution than you'd expect from satellite imagery or other, some other manned aircraft systems. A larger sample size could have improved or made more confident the results of the pixel-based classification and maybe even the object-based classification, but that is of course due to the complexity of the environment that we're trying to model and sample from. Another key takeaway from this is of course that unmanned aerial systems are still in the midst of refining their potential and finding their true potential. In terms of policy, hardware, software, and adopted applications in different fields, they're still popping up in new areas every single day. And I'm sure if you give it about a week, this presentation will be outdated because of the new systems that will be available. Thank you.
So questions for Ben?
You're looking at the resolutions on the cameras based on height. What height would be efficient to get your accuracies higher? 800 feet, 1,000 feet?
That we can't test. They recommended 10 centimeters per pixel, so the ground sampling distance of 10 centimeters per pixel. That's roughly 600 or 700 feet. But we can't legally fly above 400, so that hasn't been tested.
Right, but if you're going to go back and explain to the government, hey, to get more accurate identification for future reference, if you go back and say, hey, we'd like to fly at this height because it gives us more accurate references for data collection, that helps get those laws affected that way, because they don't understand. You guys are the experts, so you got to explain to them, we'd like to fly at this height because of this information. They understand numbers, they understand figures, facts. So that's one of the things you guys can help change the regulations. They don't know.
Yeah,
They're voting based on...
They're trying to keep us out of the,
right, out of the flying.
the airplane airspace is what they're trying to do, so. Yeah. And most of the applications early on are agricultural applications, ranchers and farmers. In the Midwest, flying as 400 feet is fine for them. So all of a sudden now we're trying it in forests, and of course, the trees are taller.
Well, terrain and stuff.
Yeah, trees are much taller than cornfield.
In all the policy that has changed over the past couple of years, would you say that it is improving or making your job easier, or?
Yeah, definitely. When we started this project, we didn't know which avenue to go down. We decided we did have to apply for a certificate of authorization to fly. Speaking with the legal counsels of the university, that changed a couple of times. But during that process, everything was done by a handwritten note, which you sent in through the mail to them. Now everything's done online. You can register your drone online. You no longer have to contact people during every single flight. You don't have to get authorization for that. Once you get the license, although that process is still up in the air, you take the test every 2 years and you have permission to fly for your purposes, with some restrictions on height and where you're at and time of day.
Yeah, we were waiting to see if we had to get a certificate of authorization, which was the initial legislation, and if we had to do that, it's about a 6-month process, going through a bunch of lawyers, and
this wouldn't exist.
It was horrendous. We didn't do it. We had the UAV and we didn't fly for a long time because of that. Other people at this university flew illegally, but we did not. And then they changed the rule in August, and we were able to, both Heather and Ben went for training one day and took the exam the next couple of days, and both passed with flying colors, and they've been flying ever since.
We took that test the first day it was available nationally.
I say, as soon as you get the license, you can fly. You are immediately covered by this blanket rule. And so you don't have to apply for anything else, no authorization from the FAA, you're just good to go. So that was a godsend when we did that.
What's most interesting is that there are no regulations for hobbyists at this point. So a hobbyist can pretty much do anything they want, and they're the ones that are given a bad name to these things flying over the White House fence.
I've seen these.
I've
seen these above the buildings in Portsmouth quite a few times on the weekend nights. So.
Yeah, you're not allowed to fly at night.
So once you get that license, do you have to have some sort of insurance through this?
There's no requirement for insurance. The license allows you to fly up to 400 feet. Fly during the daytime, there's a few other restrictions. You can't go any larger than that, can't fly over 50 pounds. There's a few other restrictions that are taken apart during when you get that license and take the test. Besides that, you take it every 2 years, and there's no other
You
requirements.
can't fly over people.
Yeah, you can't fly over people, it's restricted.
If you had more time, how much more sampling do you think you would have done?
I don't know if it's necessarily a time restriction. Like I said, we captured 9,200 images in about 2 weeks. There's no other forested environments. I mean, we could have sampled other forested areas owned by University of New Hampshire, but those are going to be just as complex, and there's no guarantee that the forest stands would have configured themselves the way we need them to.
This was really just a pilot study to see what was going on.
And we
Ben has
just
his whole
suggested-
PhD to figure out what to do next.
So you see this as sort of like a baseline, like you're setting a baseline for future work, because this is fairly new, obviously, unprecedented, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Any of the projects that are coming out, any of the review papers or scientific studies, we're all saying that we have these systems, we tested them for what they're capable of now. We can, of course, go into further detail in different avenues, and if you give it a year, all of these are going to be out of date anyways. We'll be able to, if we wanted to, just redo the same study and possibly get better results. So because of how new these sensor systems are, everyone's trying to figure out what they can do. And I think the most important takeaway is we captured 980 acres in 2 weeks, and it's at a centimeter level of resolution, which isn't capable from other platforms. You spend thousands of dollars to get that from a satellite.
Would you suggest doing it in the fall next time? Because the leaves would be off, would make it easier to determine the data?
I think so, yeah. It is a good recommendation. Mission planning or air photography has been taken for decades now. They do say try to include some sort of other context, be that the senescence, the leaves changing colors, the leaves being completely off, some sort of texture or other processing parameter. But being that I'm not an expert photo interpreter, looking at the difference between a couple different tree species on it, it could go either way in some of these scenarios. So having the leaves off could have helped, definitely.
I'm a big fan of leaf off imagery.
All the imagery used for creating those forest stands were leaf off,
I used
showing
leaf off.
just how nice they are.
Anything else? All right, thanks, man. Please grab some food on the way out the door.